Welcome to Calvary Chapel Big Bear Wednesday night study. It's obviously a little bit a little bit different than what we're used to, but hope you guys get a chance to check it out and enjoy the study, and obviously hope that you're benefited by it. So glad you guys are here. If you join me, we're just going to have a quick word of prayer as we begin our study. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 5 tonight, and try to make it not only accurate and insightful from the text itself, but also bring some application that hopefully will be relevant to you, and something that you can be built up by. So let's pray together. Father, just thank you for this time. Pray you would minister to those who are watching, and just encourage and strengthen them, Lord, as we obviously could use some encouragement always, but maybe more so at a time like this. So we just turn to you, pray you would work by your Spirit. Thank you for your faithfulness, Lord, that you love us, that you know what we're going through, and you have the desire to meet with us and speak to us individually. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for those who could enable this to take place so that we can continue to minister to people, and pray you would just use this to help and encourage your people, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so if open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 5, that'd be our starting point. I want to quickly remind you of the setting just so you kind of refresh. Boy, there's been a few things going on, and certainly might have forgotten where we exactly were in Daniel. It's understandable with all the other things that you're probably dealing with, as well as just trying to keep in touch with things that are happening around the world and in our country and in our state. So Daniel chapter 5, we're going to be introduced to a guy named Belshazzar. His name is very close to the name that was given to Daniel, Belteshazzar, Belte, Shazar. And so it's similar, but this guy's actually a different individual. He's essentially one of the leaders of the Babylonian Empire, which was at this time was dwindling. So there's a change of some settings, some circumstances. So let me just remind you of those things so that you can be in sync with the developments. The setting at this time, Nebuchadnezzar, who had been the ruler, we'd kind of focused on him in some of the events. He's the guy that conquered Jerusalem and then became the king, and he was the one who was responsible for dealing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the golden image, and then all those things, the events that took place in the earlier part of Daniel. So he's been the central figure. He reigned for about 43 years, so pretty long reign, especially for Middle Eastern monarchs, and pretty good ruler after his encounter with the Lord and being humbled by the Lord. And I think one of the things that I take out of this section we're going to be in tonight is that we don't, you and I, we're pretty common people. We don't get a chance to see or have the insights. We don't get to hang out in the what do they call it, the halls of power, the world leader kind of thing, courts, and let's say White House kind of stuff. We don't get to be around those people, see them. You might see some sort of a documentary or something, and they're pretty interesting sometimes to see what goes on behind the scenes, and sometimes you get a little feedback from the person's experience. Well, this in the sense of Daniel chapter 5 gives us a chance to see into the courts of Babylon, and not just see like, oh, I got to hang out for a day there, but to actually get insight and understanding to the individuals that are involved, their thought process. So it's really an insightful picture that God's given to us, and He's preserved it so that we could have this available to us for centuries to see God working in a behind the scenes setting here. So anyway, just I think it's interesting to see this king, this guy who's a world leader, and see how God was dealing with him, because sometimes we assume that rich people, ultra rich people, people in power, people in leaders, that they're somehow different than us, and somehow they get special treatment. And really, what God's going to show us is that He works with people's lives, and the things that He does in these guys' lives, He many times will work the same way in the lives of individuals who have some of the same issues and some of the same problems. This guy, Belshazzar, he came into the position of leadership after the the death of Nebuchadnezzar. It tells us historically, and this is the kind of history stuff that you go, maybe not that interesting to you, but there's a series of 4 kings, kind of a rapid succession over a short period of a few years. We see that kind of stuff happen. You just think about people who are out of power, want to be in power, and how that they many times are not content to be in a somewhat lesser position of power, but they want to actually gain the more power. Certainly we can see that even with our own government when one party's out of power, how they desperately want to get back in power and how they manipulate and try to work things out to get themselves back in power. Well, we get a little insight to this and this is history stuff that you may or may not like. Four kings, and there's just it's kind of like I don't know if you go back far enough. It's a daytime soap opera kind of deal, where you see these individuals grasping for power. Somebody comes into the position right after Nebuchadnezzar dies, and he doesn't last very long there. So he's replaced due to some intrigue, murder, and assassinations. There's just kind of this series of things that takes place. This guy rises to power. They kill him. They don't like him. They put somebody else in power. He doesn't last very long. And then the son of one of the guys gets into power, and they conspiracy kills the kid, and then puts a guy named Nabonidus in the role of the king. He's the sovereign king over Babylon at this time. Belshazzar is his son, and he gets designated or delegated into the position of ruling over the city of Babylon, while Nabonidus kind of moves his rule, his throne, his area to Arabia. And so it's still part of the Babylonian kingdom, but the city of Babylon's under the direct control of Belshazzar, and he rules essentially like a second in charge, a lesser king. And so that's where we see the setting taking place. Now, arising from what would be on the map to the east, the Medes and the Persians have linked together, very powerful, and they're actually eating away at the Babylonian Empire by military conquest, to the point where we pick up the story. They're actually have conquered most of the Babylonian kingdom, most likely have already defeated Nabonidus and taken him captive. But the city of Babylon was pretty unique and pretty secure because of its walls. And so that's where we see this setting is the Persian armies are around the city of Babylon, and that's what's taking place. The capital city of Babylon was an amazing city, architecturally, structurally, super impressive. We have some descriptions of it. The outer walls of the city, 17 miles long. So you think of, if you wanted to make it an actual square, I don't think it was, but say 4 miles on a side, that would be 16 square miles. So 16 miles long on the outside and 16 square miles on the inside of the city, protected by walls. Pretty significant, pretty massive city for the time. The walls themselves, 22 feet thick. The outer walls had guard towers, and the 22 feet thick and 90 feet high. So if you think there's nothing in Big Bear that's 90 feet high, that's essentially 9 stories. Normal construction, modern construction, so 9-story building. And then they had guard towers that extended from the 90-foot level up another 100 feet to give them strategic elevation. And so really impressive, super secure militarily. Not going to be something that they could at this point, the type of attacks that they would do. They just have to lay siege to this and hope that they could starve people out. The city gates were made out of bronze, so they're not going to be able to penetrate those. Within the city, there's inner and outer walls. There's a system of security that goes through, and so with gates and bars, and it would have been virtually impossible to conquer militarily. And so that gives us a little idea why they felt so secure to be doing some of the things that we're going to read about here. The city had provisions stockpiled within the city to last 20 years for the people that were there. Now, why you think, well, why would they do that? Well, okay, preparation and the anticipation at some point they would face a siege. And you think 20 years of siege? Yeah, and actually, there's some historical accounts. I think Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to a city for 25 years. So it did happen, and they were prepared in advance for this, which gives again helps us understand why would they be partying when there's an army surrounding them outside. They really felt that they were safe. They had the Euphrates River flowing through the city, so obviously they had things that you need to survive, food and water. And they go, we can stay here forever. You guys go ahead and hang out outside, and we'll be good. The riverbanks where the river passed through the city, you might think that would make them vulnerable, but they actually had walls on the riverbanks so that if an army could ever penetrate, as we're going to find out they actually did, they could trap them and essentially have them walk into an ambush and slaughter them inside the city walls, but actually not inside the city because they couldn't get out of the riverbanks. Those were gated, and we're going to see that actually God foretold through the prophet Isaiah that the gates would be opened for this individual known as Cyrus, and that God laid out the details about this several hundred years in advance, describing who Cyrus would be, and that God was going to use him in a unique way as his servant, even though he's a Persian king. And so that's the description. The gates were left unsecured, and that's part of a prophecy in Isaiah, as I just mentioned. And this city, this impenetrable city, this secure city, so well prepared, so thoroughly, thoughtfully prepared, fell in one night. That's the amazing thing. It's something that seems so secure, and it's not a problem for the Lord. And He foretold this, and we're going to see this event taking place. Part of the picture for me that I think of this guy Belshazzar. Certainly, the picture of him and the story, you can relate to it. You've probably seen individuals. You can certainly, kind of transpose the idea to people of great power and influence, partying, full of self-confidence, thinking they got it all under control, while at the same time they're not godly people. They're wicked people. And some part of that, as a believer, you kind of go, I struggle with that. How do they, it seems like they're getting away with it. And I would just encourage you, if you're not familiar with Psalm 73, to take the time to read a little bit through Psalm 73, which is kind of the musings, the thoughts of a believer wrestling with the idea that he knows God is good, but sometimes he sees stuff that makes it hard for him, makes it difficult, challenging, when it seems that the wicked are prospering, and it's like, well, I don't get this, Lord. I'm trying to live for you, and sometimes it's difficult, and we don't experience the kind of fair, just treatment we would expect, and then we see other people who are living completely contrary to the Lord and openly wicked, and they seem for a time to get away with it. And it creates a challenge, a struggle within inside us, and that's what Psalm 73 is about. The psalmist writes, and he goes, it's almost like you can see him watching this event. I'm sure that he had other things in his mind, but it connects with Daniel chapter 5, where imagine being at this party with all these lords, and there's concubines, and it's clearly it's kind of a we'd say an immoral setting, and they're partying it up, and there's the wine is flowing, and then in the midst of this party, Belshazzar stands up and starts to speak arrogantly and even blaspheme and commit sacrilege by bringing the temple implements from the temple in Jerusalem into this obscene setting and making boasts and brags. And Here's Psalm 73, verse 11, where the psalmist in this passage says, they say, he's talking about the wicked, how does God know? See, it's like this attitude of complete contempt and disrespect, mocking God, saying, God doesn't see. If He sees it, why didn't He do something? See, nothing's happening, so God doesn't know. Is there knowledge in the Most High? Behold, He says, these are the ungodly who are always at ease. They increase in riches. And there's times that we see it in that way. And then verse 16, he says his kind of personal thoughts on this whole struggle. And he says, when I thought to how to understand this, how do I reconcile this, the truth that I know about God and this stuff that I see in front of me, how do I reconcile it? He says it was too painful. It was too painful for me. I just couldn't even wrap my head around it. And said, until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. See, part of it, he's saying, what you see at this moment isn't the end of the story. And so that's part of it to understand when we get it, the insight of going into the Lord's presence, into the sanctuary where we would meet with the Lord, hear from His word. You go, hey, there's more to the picture than what you can see right at this moment. We're finite, limited. We don't see the end of the story, but God tells us the end of the story. In this case, we're going to see in Daniel chapter 5, we're going to get to see kind of the end of the story for this guy Belshazzar, and it's a perspective that God's given to us and preserved for us to say, hey, this is what it's about. This is what happens. And so in verse 18, we're going to see this kind of thing happens suddenly, unexpectedly to Belshazzar. Surely, Lord, you set them in slippery places, and you cast them down to destruction. Oh, how they are brought to desolation as in a moment. Just suddenly, unexpectedly, when everything seems to be, totally within their controls, all of a sudden, the Lord brings desolation, destruction, and they're utterly consumed with terrors. And we're going to see that actually lived out vividly right in this story. So look at verse 1, and here's this party setting that we have in the city of Babylon with the Medes and the Persians gathered around the outside of the city. It tells us in verse 1 that Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords. That would be the levels of leadership. These are the lords. And you think, what if the city's surrounded with an army, how did these guys get in? Well, most likely they fled from their places of responsibility, their places of leadership that had already been conquered. They fled first and fled to Babylon. So they're all gathered together. You might think, well, they're hunkering down in fear. Maybe. But Belshazzar's, in a sense, trying to build morale by going, hey, we're totally fine. We can just hang out here and party. We got nothing to worry about. 1,000 of the lords. Can you imagine being at a party, this kind of a party, where there's 1,000 world leaders or national leaders or empire leaders, you'd say, and their wives and their concubines and all the assorted people and tag-alongs and everything. So we're talking about several thousands of people at this party. I mean, talking about a big old shindig. That's what's going on here. And then Belshazzar not only facilitates the party, but he's getting drunk himself. He drinks wine in the presence of the thousands, so he's actually entering into this party and participating. And while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave command to bring the gold and the silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple. This is the temple in Jerusalem, and that the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. That's what the term is sacrilege. Is taking something that's holy and treating as if it's unholy or common. And so there's an insult. Notice it's only the vessels from the temple. So there's something underlying here that we don't get explained to us. There's a hostility towards the true and living God. There's something in this where he's maybe it's a thing where he's going, hey, you know what? I want you guys we're going to drink out of these cups because these cups are trophies, a tribute of how we as Babylonians conquered this nation, and it could be part of that. But they're taking these things not just from the king's house in Jerusalem, but from the temple itself. So there's some underlying things that we don't get explained completely. But there's a hostility, there's a antagonism towards the God of the temple and the God of Israel. And so he brings it out so they can use them for their drinking party. And then it says the vessels of gold that they had taken from the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them, and they drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So you see, they're mocking God here. This is something that's like, some lesser lord is going, praise the God of gold, and they start to just, come on, let's be honest. We've all been around people who are drunk. They don't say the most intelligent things. Yeah, it's just, drinking doesn't raise your intelligence. It doesn't raise your insight. It doesn't increase your wisdom. It makes you more and more foolish and stupid. And I can say that from my own experience. But I'm sure you've seen people and you go, they definitely don't get any wiser when they drink. They get more foolish. And so they're doing this thing, making fun, mocking, and this is the setting. And then while they're having this great old time, the party's really rocking at this point. And the same hour, while this is taking place, the fingers of a man's hand, it appears to be just a hand, that comes out of the air and begins to write opposite the lampstand on a plaster wall. That's a little detail that's kind of interesting because it tells us in a lighted area, whereas opposite the lampstand, so the light would be cast on it so people could see it. On a plaster wall was kind of a nice writing area. This finger comes out and begins to write on the wall in the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And so the king notices, the king's countenance changed. I just think, what a quench to this party. Everybody's rocking and laughing, screaming, yelling, doing all that kind of crazy stuff. And all of a sudden it's like dead silence. The king's all mocking and, full of himself. And all of a sudden, whoa, his countenance changed. You could just see the face, his face drops. And his thoughts troubled him. He's greatly disturbed, frightened by what he sees. The joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked together. I mean, he's so scared that he's shaking in his boots, we'd say. He's literally, his knees are knocking. And so this is very terrifying to him, maybe because of the sight, but there's a message being delivered there, and he doesn't really understand what it is. But it's interesting. It's written by the fingers. I'm assuming it's one finger that would actually do the writing. And in that sense, there's a little detail that's really interesting if you track it just through a couple spots in the Old Testament about the finger of God. And in the book of Exodus, when Moses was performing miracles to show Pharaoh the power of God, at one point the magicians responded to a miracle that that God had done through Moses and said, "This isn't Moses. This is the finger of God." It's so interesting, and I think it's just, I don't know, just interesting to me. It's not the hand of God. It's not the fist of God. It's the finger of God. It's like just his little old finger, and he's doing this miraculous stuff. He's not even breaking a sweat, so to speak, to do these miracles. And Pharaoh's heart, not impressed. Pharaoh was a stubborn man. His heart grew hard. He hardened himself. He rejected the idea. Wasn't willing to be taught. That's kind of the message in this chapter about, are we, as a person, willing to hear and respond and be taught when the Lord desires to give instruction, or do they harden themselves against it? And that's really a foolish choice, but many times that's what we do. The Lord speaks to us. He gives us an insight. He makes something clear to us, and we have a choice whether we're going to receive it and respond to it, or whether we're going to reject it. And so in this case, the finger of God does a work, a miracle, a powerful miracle, and Pharaoh says, forget it. And then Exodus chapter 31, at Mount Sinai, when Moses was given the law, it tells us that he gave Moses 2 tablets of testimony, tablets of stone that were written with the finger of God. So this is not a unique thing we're reading in Daniel, where God actually writes messages with his own finger. And then we see in the New Testament an interesting connection for us as New Testament, followers of Jesus. Luke chapter 11, it says, if God casts out demons with the finger of God. This is Jesus talking to the scribes and Pharisees. He goes, you guys are accusing me of being evil, but there's another explanation. If God's here and he's casting out demons, overcoming darkness with just his little finger, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. And that's Jesus describing his ministry. And he says, this is not a big effort for God to do this. It's a simple thing of with his finger, he can cast out these demons. And so we see this handwriting. It freaks him out. He wants to know what the message is. So in verse 7, he says, the king cried aloud and said, bring the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. And notice he doesn't ask for Daniel. He's part of this kingdom. He's got some history here. At this point, Daniel would have been an older man, probably in his 80s. And he's got a long history in the kingdom, but also he's always been viewed as an outsider by the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, the magicians, the astrologers. He's not one of them. And so those guys Belshazzar turns to these guys. It's not unlike we've seen with Nebuchadnezzar. It's not unlike what happens with our lives. A lot of times people get in trouble. They realize they need help. They turn here, there, everywhere until they get no answers. And then finally they turn to God. In this case, he tries the wise men. He says, hey, whoever reads this writing tells me its interpretation will be clothed with purple, a position of honor, royalty, have a chain of gold around his neck, and he'll be the third ruler in the kingdom. You say, third ruler, what do you mean? What does that mean? Well, Nebuchadnezzar's father's the king. Belshazzar's number 2 in the kingdom. So whoever interprets this would be number 3 in the kingdom, the third ruler. And that's been substantiated by a couple different sources in, not that you care too much about that, but in archaeology. Obviously, not all the records are found because some of the stuff's lost, but we actually have this verified through archaeology that Nabonidus was the king, the father. His son was Belshazzar, was the second in control, second in charge, the second king in the kingdom. And so the only position he had available to give to him was something less. And so that would be the third king, third in the kingdom. Okay, and so verse 8, it tells us that all the king's wise men came. They could not read the writing or make known its interpretation. It's possible that God just blinded them and prevented them from seeing it, preventing it from understanding it. It could be a less supernatural thing. Its message most certainly was written in Hebrew. And since the Jewish nation ceased to exist, there would have been very little motivation for these guys to study Hebrew. And so it could have been just presented in the way that they didn't see it and couldn't understand it because they couldn't read Hebrew. We don't get the explanation. They just didn't know. Okay, so Belshazzar's greatly troubled. His countenance has changed. The lords were astonished. Now he's kind of really freaked out, and he doesn't know what to do with this. He's turned to all his resources, wise men, all the human resources that he has available. And these guys had been center of knowledge and science. So he's like, we don't have the answer to this. What do we do? What am I going to do? This is obviously some supernatural message, and I'm not getting it. So verse 10 tells us that the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet call. So, probably the word got out, the rumblings through the palace. Oh, this is happening, and something's taking place, and she hears about it. This is probably what we would maybe refer to as the queen mother. She seems to be the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, and that would make her a great grandmother probably of this guy Belshazzar, or a grandmother of Belshazzar. And so she comes. She's still a fixture in the palace, and obviously respected because of her previous role, but really not active in the day-to-day things of the palace. And so she hears about it, and she comes, and she's got some insight, some things to throw in. She's got a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom. She's seen things go through the kingdom, and so she's going to chime in here. And she says, "O Lord, O King, live forever." Don't let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. It's kind of like, hey, cheer up. There's an answer. You don't have it yet, but I can tell you, I can help you. And so what she says is, there's a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. Now we know from last chapter, that's a clear reference to Daniel. That's how Nebuchadnezzar described him. And he said, the Spirit of the Holy God, the Spirit of the true God's in you. And so this lady had seen Daniel in action, so to speak, and she knew that God was in him and used him. And you think about it, that's the kind of testimony that we want to have in our lives, that maybe we're not perfect people. Well, maybe, of course we're not, but this God is this. And that tells God tells that in the New Testament, book of 1 Corinthians. Don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, who is from? And so we have resources available for wisdom by turning to the Lord and saying, God, would you speak through me? Would you help me minister to these people? Because you have the resources, you have the wisdom that they need. And so she says, there's somebody here that we could turn to, and in him is the Spirit of the Holy God. And then she reminds him, and it's, this guy knew this stuff, but he rejected it. And, you think of sometimes you have people who have a lot of knowledge about God, but they have not chosen to surrender to him. They've chosen to reject it, to harden themselves, to say, I don't need help, I don't need God, I can do my own thing. Well, that's apparently what Belshazzar had done. So this time Grandma is the queen is going to remind him. It said, in the days of your father, meaning your forefather, actually grandfather in this case, but it's talking about your predecessor, family predecessor. He had light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in this individual. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the father of the king, made him chief of the magicians and astrologers and Chaldeans and soothsayers. Now maybe, because of the power struggles, there's a big class of these magicians and soothsayers. They'd kind of moved Daniel out, moved him to a lesser position, but he's just faithfully serving the kingdom. He's had some significant roles in influencing the direction of the kingdom, primarily through Nebuchadnezzar, his influence with Nebuchadnezzar and that interaction. But he's older, and they really don't have any respect for him to begin with. So he's not even, when they call for all the counselors, they don't call him. They just go, don't notify that guy. He's got nothing to offer. Oh yeah, he does. He's had already in their history, their personal history. This guy Belshazzar, this is his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar that had this experience. That he heard about it. We're going to see. The text tells us he knew about this, but he's like a lot of kids and grandkids. It's like, well, I got nothing to learn from those old people. They got nothing to offer me. And it's like, really? So you're so experienced, you got nothing to learn from somebody who has been used mightily by God, or had this dramatic encounter with the living God that brought him from a place of arrogance to a place of humility? And you got nothing to learn from that, there's nothing that you can be helped by, then that's just a guarantee. You're going to continue to be prideful and arrogant, and you're going to have to learn the hard way if you learn it all. And so verse 12, the queen says, this guy's influenced our nation. He's helped our nation. He's had this profound impact, and he's had wisdom and light and understanding. And why wouldn't you turn to him? In as much as an excellent spirit, excellent, just think of that, excel. It means it surpasses. His spirit's better than what they had available to him. Knowledge and understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, explaining enigmas, hidden riddles that this is a mystery, and he can explain those things. Why wouldn't you turn to him? Those things were found in Daniel, whose king named Belshazzar, but the queen, interestingly, refers to him by his Hebrew name, Daniel. It's kind of a statement of respect of who this guy is, even though we changed his name and tried to get him to identify with Bel, the god of Babylon. He's Daniel, who says, God, the true and living God, is my judge. That's his name, what his name means. And so no, you should ask him. Call Daniel. Let Daniel be called. He will give the interpretation. And so Daniel comes. They send a messenger, bring him in. And Daniel was brought before the king. The king spoke, said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel?" He's a little man in front of him. He says, "I've heard about you. Are you the Daniel? The one who is from the captives of Judah, that the Spirit of God is you, and that the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. I've heard about you," right? And so the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, and so that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I've heard of you that you can give interpretations, that you can explain enigmas. And now if you can read the writing that is made and make known to me its interpretation, you will be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and you shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel, in a sense, is being told, "Hey, if you do this, I'll pay you. I'll give you this big time reward." And Daniel responds with just amazing integrity. He's going, my ministry is not for sale. I'm not going to do it just because you offer to pay me. You can keep your money. And so Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known the interpretation." He's not a servant of God for hire. He's just a servant of God. And so, verse 8, "O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom, majesty, glory, and honor." And Nebuchadnezzar agreed with that after he was humbled. He realized that God had given him that position. You see the connection. If Belshazzar would think about it, if he was willing to learn, he would have realized, I'm in that position now because my grandfather was given that position. So if he got the position from God, maybe I should realize that I'm only here because of God. And so because of the majesty that God gave him, all peoples, nations, trembled before him. He had authority and sovereignty over many peoples and nations. And whomever he wished, he executed. And whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. He was sovereign, put in that position by the Lord. And so, verse 20, he says, "But when his heart was lifted up." I mean, you think of a primary lesson, a statement, a legacy that you would leave. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy should have been very plain. This statement that God is able to humble those who walk in pride. He had lots of worldly reasons to think, yeah, I've done this and I've done that. But the truth was, God gave him that position. So, the New Testament tells us, what do you have that you have not received? And so there should be a tremendous humility and gratefulness in our hearts when we understand, not that we just think horribly about ourselves, that's not it, but that we think fully, accurately. That's where humility comes, when you realize this, okay, Nebuchadnezzar had been put in this position, amazing position of power and glory, but he was put in that position. God gave him that position. So it should bring humility to go, this is not because of me, it's because of him. And so when we see accurately, it puts us in a right relationship with God to say, you're God, I'm not. You give grace and mercy. I'm the recipient of that. And so that should have been the lesson of Nebuchadnezzar's life. Hopefully, as a parent, he would want to communicate that more to his children and his grandchildren than anybody. But you know how we are as human beings. Sometimes we're like, yeah, Grandpa, you don't know what you're talking about. Oh, Grandpa, you're old. Yeah, Grandpa, you don't know. You're not as smart as I am. You're not as wise. And he, like a grandpa looking at him going, oh, grandson, oh, I'm so sorry. You're headed down a path that's going to lead to real difficulty in your life. Things that could come into your life because God knows how to humble those who walk in pride. And it's not going to be pleasant. But if you respond and be teachable and be humble and allow God to humble you, then in the end, it'll be a blessing. In the end, it'll be good. And so when it tells us that when Nebuchadnezzar's heart was lifted up, his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne. That's what the story we read of uh, him going insane after he's rejecting God's call to humility and repentance, and they took his glory from him. And verse 21, then he was driven from the sons of men. Remember, he went out and lived like a crazy person, homeless, crazy person. His heart was made like the beasts, dwelling with the wild oxen. They fed him with grass. His body was wet with the dew. He's just a guy that's just, you go, he's gone. But he lived that way for 7 years until he came to that point of revelation, of eye-opening, as he humbled himself finally before the Lord. I mean, you think of us, I think 7 years living like that, dude, you're a tough guy. I mean, you're stubborn. You just refuse to surrender, refuse to humble yourself for 7 years living in that kind of degradation. And it's like, yeah, but I don't know. You think about maybe your life before you came to the Lord. How many years of craziness, insanity, insane behavior, how much deprivation, degradation did you live in until you came to your senses and went, oh man, why am I doing this? Why am I fighting against the Lord? When he came to the point of understanding, believing, knowing that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses, then he came to his senses. It says that his reason returned to him. And he says, but you, Belshazzar, this is your grandfather. You know this story. You know the lessons. You understand it. You probably heard it from your grandpa. So, but you, Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart. Even though you knew all this. I mean, it's really a statement of the arrogance that oftentimes we've had it. Where we go, it's like, you can't tell me nothing. I'm smarter. I'm not going to make the same mistakes you made. And it's like, here's a kid, grandchild, walking in arrogance, thinking that he's all that in a bag of chips. And it brings up the question of being teachable. And the Bible has so much to say about this, and we see it just kind of vividly in this passage here. But Proverbs 1 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. See, it starts with, am I going to be teachable to God? Am I going to allow God to teach me, tell me what's right, tell me what's wrong? Am I going to respect, fear, have reverence for God, that he's God and I'm not? And you can look back to before you became a Christian and realize that you didn't have the fear of the Lord. You were walking in sin, doing your own thing, total defiance, rebellion against God. I mean, I can remember many times in my own life thinking, well, I know this isn't right, but I know I shouldn't, and I would go ahead and do it. It was just like I had conviction in my heart that it was not the right thing to do, but I wasn't humbled, wasn't being willing to be teachable or responsive to the conviction of the Spirit of God or the conscience that spoke loudly in my heart. I just wanted to do my own thing. And he says, well, the fear of the Lord, that's where you start. If you start there, that's the beginning of knowledge. Then you're going to be teachable if you have a respect, a reverence, an awe, a fear, saying God matters more than anything. Then you can start from that place and grow and gain knowledge and wisdom. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. And sadly, we can look at all kinds of examples of this without picking on any specific group of people. We can say, yeah, we see examples of that when we were teenagers. Couldn't tell me nothing. I knew everything. I think as a crack up when I have, I can flash back to my own family and have my 13-year-old daughter that's never driven a car before in her life telling me how to drive. And you go, how do you know how to do this? But you're an authority on it and you never even done it, So things like that where you just go, wow, okay, can I teach you something? No, I don't need to learn it. I know what I'm doing. Okay, well, that's a foolish attitude. Instead of being willing to be instructed, to listen to wisdom that other people have, gathered, sometimes by their own life experience, sometimes by just the hard road that they've gone through, and to receive wisdom from them. And he says, that's so foolish to despise that and go, I don't need that. I'm smart enough. I'm wise enough by myself. Foolish position to be in. And that's where Belshazzar was. So Proverbs 12:1 says, whoever loves instructions loves knowledge. but he who hates correction is stupid. I mean, you find a lot of practical illustrations. Don't stick your finger in the light socket. Don't tell me what to do. Okay, that's stupid. You don't want somebody to help you, somebody to teach you. Don't hold the saw that way. You're going to cut your fingers off. Oh, you can't tell me what to do. Okay, that's dumb. It's going to be a painful lesson for you to find out the hard way. Decisions a lot. No, don't live that way. Don't treat those people that way. Here's what God is. Oh, don't tell me what to do. You don't know. Okay, well, if you don't want to be corrected, you don't want somebody to help you do it correctly. That's pretty dumb. Why wouldn't you want to receive correction? Proverbs 3 says, the wise shall inherit glory, but shame shall be the legacy of fools. You think of this guy, Belshazzar, he lost the kingdom because of his arrogance and his sacrilege and blasphemy and mocking the living God. And you go, that's the legacy of this guy. He is a fool. Poor guy. His story is preserved, and over 2,000 years and more, people have been reading the story and saying, what a fool this guy Belshazzar was. He had all this going for him, but he wouldn't humble himself, and he knew better, and that's so foolish. Aren't you glad your life's not in the Bible? I'm pretty glad. So I'd hate to have people, I want people to learn the lessons I've learned or benefit from them, but I don't want it to be like in the book. That would not be good. Verse 23 and 24, you've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. That's the arrogance of the human heart to be able to be defiant against the Lord of heaven, the Lord of glory, the Lord of the universe, Lord of all creation. And we can stand like a little ant and shake our fist in his face and say, you can't tell me what to do. Okay, well, that's definitely a prideful, puffed up heart. And he says, you brought the vessels of the house, of his house before you, you and your lords, your wives and your concubines, and you've drunk wine from them, and you've praised the gods of silver and gold and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand owns all your ways, and you have not glorified him. Wow. What an incredible insight and vivid and poetically expressed. Daniel says he holds your breath. I mean, dude, you realize if God wanted to, he could just say, no more breath for you, and you're done. I mean, we're so arrogant, we don't realize that our next heartbeat, our next breath are not in our control. And yet we still so many times refuse to honor the God who has our breath in his hands, and to glorify him for the life that we have, the blessings that come, the position, the glory, the honor, all that he's poured into our lives. James tells us every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, in whom there's no shadow, no shifting. He doesn't change. Every good thing that's in your life comes from him, regardless of whether you're walking with him or not. He's gracious and good, and everything that's good that comes into your life comes from his hand. And yet so often we refuse to glorify him. And he's like, oh, that's so foolish to miss what he has done and not honor him and glorify him. Verse 24 and 25, he says, the fingers of the hand were sent from him, the writing, this writing was written. Here's Daniel sharing what God revealed to him. This is the inscription that was written, many, tekel upharsin, and he says, this is the interpretation of each word. Many means God has numbered. There's like a meaning that comes from each word. It's not the literal translation of every part of it, but the meaning. And so God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. So Judgment Day, it's been evaluated. You failed the test, and you're going to lose the kingdom. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. That's for him personally. Kingdom and his leadership, but also him personally, weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and will be given to the Medes and the Persians, the army that sits outside. And verse 30, Belshazzar gave the command. So he hears that. I don't know that he believed it, because if he really believed his kingdom was going to be divided, then why would he give a reward and say, you're going to be number 3 in the kingdom? That's not going to exist. a little bit like maybe he didn't quite buy it. But Belshazzar gave the command. They clothed Daniel with purple, put a chain of gold around his neck, made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. There are historical, ancient history writers like Herodotus, who believe that the reason they could have this party going on, even as the Median Persian army was entering the city and actually conquering parts of the city, because the city was so big that they didn't even know it had fallen until the Median Persian armies actually, they had a specific, like a special forces team dispatched to the palace, and that they burst into this party and killed Belshazzar immediately as the party was, in a sense, being closed by the Medes and the Persians. And so that very night, it says, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. We'll talk a little bit about the details on who this guy Darius is, and an individual named Cyrus, who actually was the general, and but most likely designated this guy Darius as the ruler over Babylon. Cyrus was prophesied in the book of Isaiah. Specifically, God said that he would use Cyrus as a servant to the people of God, and he would actually cause this Gentile king to be the instrument to send or allow the people of God, the Jewish people, to return to Jerusalem. This is almost 7-year time framework from the time of the initial destruction of Jerusalem, and it's about time for them to be able to be released. And Cyrus is the guy that God calls by name in the book of Isaiah and tells him what his role is going to be. There's a Jewish legend that when Cyrus came into the city of the city of Babylon, when he conquered and he actually entered the city, that Daniel met him as he entered the city, met him and gave him a copy of the scroll of Isaiah, which had the prophecy, which named him by name over 200 years before his birth. And that obviously impressed him and caused him to be willing to listen to Daniel, to learn from him, and to respond to the call, the role that God had spelled out for him, to be that deliverer, to bring the people back to the city of Jerusalem. It's an amazing thing, and it's all part of this story. Tremendous stuff. I think the primary lesson that I get out of this little section is the problem of pride, the pride of the human heart. And it doesn't have to be a person who's in a great position of power. Sometimes it's somebody who's a teenager who just goes, "You can't tell me nothing. I know everything." And how destructive, how painful that course of action is, even as the Proverbs tell us time and time again. A fool despises wisdom, despises instruction, despises correction. They won't let anyone tell them, "Hey, you're headed the wrong way. This is a path of light. This is a path of wisdom." Just look at the examples that you have before you. In this case, Belshazzar, he had his own grandfather who had gone through that arrogance and defiance and suffered and was humbled by God, but humbled so that God would do good to him in the end. And the humility that God wants to bring into our lives is not to hurt us, but it's to bless us, to bring us into that right relationship where we see him truthfully for who he is and all that he's done, and then we see ourselves in that place of we're sinners who need the mercy of God. We need the grace of God. When we come to that point, it opens the doors for blessing and goodness and direction, and for God, when we humble ourselves, God promises that he will lift us up. But if we exalt ourselves, he will humble us, because he wants us to know the truth and to be free. So great chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to continue to pray for people around you. Continue to be wise in terms of preparations and stuff regarding the limiting the infection, limiting your exposure, that kind of stuff. Please just be wise about that. Be attentive. Go the extra mile. Reach out. Make phone calls to one another. Try to think about people that maybe you're missing. Obviously, we haven't seen each other a lot, so the only way you can contact and stay in touch is probably by phone or through the internet, through emails and texts and social media. So please take advantage of that, and please continue to look around you, be attentive to the Spirit of God, and allow Him to remind you of people. Go, hey, what about so-and-so? Track them down. Tell them you've been thinking about them. Pray for them. And we'll just continue to trust the Lord and encourage each other. And we'll take one day at a time, because that's all we get. We're not supposed to be anxious about tomorrow. We don't know what tomorrow's going to bring, but today's got enough for us to deal with. So let's keep our thoughts directed on, okay, how do we respond today? What are we doing today? Don't miss the people around you, and let's just go one step at a time through this thing. So God bless you. Hopefully we'll see you on Sunday. If you get a chance, hopefully we'll see you on Sunday. Not sit literally, but we'll see you on the site on Sunday, checking out the Sunday service. So God bless you. Thanks for being here.